America was built for cars. The United States did not become car dependent by accident. Pun intended. Over the last century, American cities were designed around a single assumption, that most people would drive for nearly every trip. For millions of Americans, driving isn't a preference, it's a requirement. For work, for groceries, for healthcare, for daily life. That outcome wasn't inevitable. Mid-20th century highway visions promised speed, efficiency, and modernity, but they quietly removed alternatives to driving in the process. So, how did the automobile shift from one option among many to the default condition for participating in American society? To answer that, we need to rewind.
The accelerating rate of men's progress in all fields of endeavor has paralleled closely our progress in the freedom of movement from place to place. New things to do and new ways to do them. Telephone, electric lights, automobiles, aircraft, all are symbols of better living. New places to go and new means of getting there. With a growing appreciation of the wisdom of applying the road tax monies to the road building program for which they were designed, highway development is going on at a rapidly increasing pace.
Look at this future. Perfect highways, endless motion, no congestion. In 1940, this wasn't science fiction. It was a promise. Roads floating above cities, traffic that never stopped, a city engineered around speed and control. What's missing is easy to overlook, because once a country is built around this vision, driving stops being a choice. It becomes a condition of participation. Today, over 90% of all trips in the United States are made by car, even when many of them are under 3 miles or just about 5,000 meters for my international viewers. The car is not simply part of American life, it governs access to it. So the question isn't whether cars are useful, the question is why the United States organized itself around the most expensive, dangerous, and space-intensive form of transportation ever adopted at scale. Not by accident, not by natural preference, but through policy, planning, and power. Now, let me be clear, this isn't an argument against people who drive. Most Americans drive because the system leaves them no realistic alternative. To understand how driving became mandatory, we have to begin before cars mattered at all, when American cities were designed around people. Chapter 1. Before cars, America was a walking country. Before automobiles, American cities were built to human scale, not European scale, not idealized scale, practical scale. Most people moved at 3 speeds: walking, horseback, streetcar. That reality shaped everything. Cities stayed compact because distance cost time and energy. Homes clustered near jobs. Markets sat on corners. Schools anchored neighborhoods. Density wasn't an ideology, it was necessity. Chicago in the 1890s placed factories along rail corridors, with workers living steps away. Cleveland's Euclid Avenue mixed shops, offices, theaters, and residences along a single walkable spine. Even Los Angeles, now synonymous with sprawl, once told a different story. By 1920, it operated the largest streetcar network on Earth. Over 1,000 miles of Pacific Electric track connecting downtown to Long Beach and beyond. And yet, that system would not survive the mid-20th century. In the 1940s and 1950s, subsidiaries of National City Lines, a holding company funded by General Motors, Firestone Tire, Standard Oil of California, and other auto-related firms, began acquiring key portions of electric streetcar systems across the country. Los Angeles was one of their targets. National City Lines and its affiliates, including Pacific City Lines, did not purchase the entire Pacific Electric system all at once. Instead, they acquired profitable routes, gained control over operations, and systematically replaced electric red car streetcars with diesel buses. This campaign is often referred to as the General Motors streetcar conspiracy. The goal was not simply transportation reform. It was vertical integration. If streetcars disappeared, cities would need buses. Buses required rubber tires, petroleum fuel, and replacement parts, all products sold by the same corporations funding the takeover. To be clear, Pacific Electric was already struggling. By the late 1920s, rising car ownership, increasing congestion, and declining ridership had weakened the system. The streetcar network was not destroyed from a position of strength, but corporate acquisition accelerated its conversion. In 1949, a federal jury convicted General Motors and its partners of conspiring to monopolize the sale of buses and related supplies to transit companies. The penalties were minor. The structural shift was not. The remaining passenger lines were sold to a private bus company in 1953, and in 1961, the last red car was removed from service. What had once been the largest interurban rail system in the world was dismantled. Its right-of-ways were paved, fragmented, or abandoned. Decades later, Southern California would spend hundreds of millions and eventually billions to rebuild light rail along corridors that once carried trains. The story of Pacific Electric was not the only reason Los Angeles became car dependent, but it became a powerful symbol of a broader shift, from rail to rubber, from shared mobility to private obligation. And once those tracks were gone, distance expanded. Streets were not merely infrastructure, they were public space. Children played, vendors sold food, neighbors talked. Crossing happened where it made sense. This matters because it establishes a baseline. That world didn't disappear gradually, it collided with a new machine. Chapter 2. Early automobiles were chaos machines. When automobiles first appeared on American streets in the early 1900s, they were not welcomed as progress. They were loud, unreliable, hard to stop, and hard to steer. And they entered streets that were already crowded with, as I mentioned before, pedestrians, streetcars, horse-drawn wagons, bicycles, vendors, and children at play. There were no licenses, no standardized rules, no clear right-of-way. Cars moved faster than anything else on the street, and everyone else was expected to adapt. Chaos followed. By the 1910s and 1920s, urban newspapers were filled with reports of traffic violence. A New York boy dragged several blocks by a malfunctioning automobile. A family in Pittsburgh killed when a frightened horse bolted into traffic. Children struck while playing games in streets they had always used freely. Within a decade, automobiles became one of the leading causes of death for children in American cities. Public anger grew. Cities responded with restrictions. Speed limits as low as 8 miles per hour, arrest for reckless driving, temporary car bans on residential streets. In some places, crowds overturned cars after fatal crashes. The message was clear. The automobile was the problem. But automobile manufacturers and affiliated organizations refused that framing. Instead, they launched one of the earliest large-scale public relations campaigns in American history.
Hugh, it sounds very exciting. May I come just as I am?
Their goal was to shift blame. Pedestrians were no longer street users. They were obstacles. The term jaywalker was popularized to describe anyone who crossed the street outside of newly defined zones. Jay was slang for someone backwards, unsophisticated, or out of place. Crossing freely was reframed as ignorant behavior. Cities did not redesign cars. They criminalized the people who moved differently. This shift was reinforced by a new professional class, traffic engineers. In 1924, Miller McClintock, a leading traffic engineer and later director of Harvard's Bureau for Street Traffic Research, explained the new priority clearly. He wrote that streets should be understood as channels for traffic, not places for people to linger. This was a turning point, because once streets were defined primarily as conduits for movement, any activity that slowed vehicles became a problem to solve. Children playing? Nope. Neighbors gathering? Find somewhere else. Vendors stopping? Move along. Crossing wherever it made sense, good luck with that. Safety was redefined, not as reducing danger, but as organizing behavior around faster machines. Curbs appeared to separate space. Signals replaced negotiation. Police enforcement prioritized uninterrupted flow over local access. The goal was no longer to make cities safer for people, it was to make them predictable for automobiles. Not everyone agreed. Urban reformers, journalists, and civic advocates warned that something vital was being lost. In 1927, Lewis Mumford, one of the most influential urban thinkers of the era, issued a stark warning. He wrote, "The street is no longer a place for human association. It has become a traffic machine." Mumford understood what was at stake. This was not simply a debate about safety. It was a struggle over what cities were for. But the automobile had momentum, and it had money. By the late 1920s, the reframing was complete. Traffic deaths were treated as behavioral failures. Congestion was treated as proof of success, and redesigning cities for faster movement was treated as common sense. What began as an attempt to manage chaos became a blueprint. And once streets were redesigned to prioritize speed, a deeper assumption followed, that faster movement was inherently better, that delay was inefficiency, that cities existed to move vehicles, not to support daily life. This line of thinking was openly promoted by the automobile industry itself. In the 1920s, Charles F. Kettering, head of research at General Motors, argued that congestion was not a warning sign, but a justification. He wrote, "The solution of the traffic problem is more automobiles." This was not satire. It was strategy. If congestion existed, the answer was not to slow cars. It was to redesign cities to absorb even more of them. Wider streets, straighter roads, fewer interruptions. Speed was reframed as efficiency, efficiency as progress, and progress as inevitability. At that point, the conflict was no longer between cars and pedestrians, it was between two ideas of the city itself. And the automobile had the advantage, because speed was not just practical, it could be sold as modern. Chapter 3. Selling speed as modernity. Over time, resistance faded. The automobile became a symbol of modern life. Freedom, efficiency, control. Advertising equated speed with progress, and delay with failure. Traffic engineering emerged as a discipline, streets widened, curbs hardened, pedestrians were confined to narrower zones. Shared space disappeared. Cars dominated. People adapted. Yet for decades, alternatives still existed. Streetcars remained essential. Neighborhoods stayed mixed. Other wealthy countries built highways too, but they did not eliminate alternatives. In places like Tokyo or Copenhagen, daily life could still function without owning a car, even if people chose to drive. To make driving unavoidable required more than culture. It required federal intervention. Chapter 4. Federal roads as national destiny. During the Great Depression, road construction provided jobs. During World War II, highways were reframed as national defense. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act committed the country to 41,000 miles of interstate highways, funded almost entirely by the federal government. Local opposition carried little weight. The routes chosen were not neutral. Highways cut through dense urban neighborhoods, disproportionately affecting Black, immigrant, and working-class communities. Boston's West End was erased. New Orleans' Claiborne Avenue, a thriving Black commercial corridor, was dismantled. Nationally, roughly 475,000 people were displaced. Highways fractured cities, and they enabled something new: distance. Chapter 5. Suburbs were a policy machine. Suburbanization was not organic, it was engineered. Federal mortgage policy favored single-family homes, penalized apartments. Redlining excluded Black families from wealth accumulation. Zoning separated homes from jobs and commerce. Density was restricted. Mixed use was prohibited. Places like Levittown normalized a car-dependent lifestyle. One breadwinner, one homemaker, a vehicle required for every errand. Very Leave It to Beaver, if you understand the reference. The social model changed. The physical one stayed locked in place, and parking ensured it remained that way. Chapter 6. Zoning, Parking, and the Death of Distance. Parking minimums mandated large quantities of off-street parking for nearly every building. The result was distance. Buildings spread apart, destinations grew farther away, transit struggled to compete, walking declined, driving became the legal default. By mid-century, living without a car was no longer just difficult. In many places, it was effectively impossible. Consider someone who can't drive: a teenager, an older adult, a person with a medical condition. In much of the United States, losing the ability to drive doesn't just reduce mobility, it ends independence. That is not a personal failure, it's a design choice. Chapter 7: Choice, Necessity, and a Designed System. This is not an argument that Americans should stop liking cars, and it's not a proposal to ban driving, and it's not a claim that every place can or should operate without automobiles. In many rural areas, small towns, and low-density regions, cars remain essential. They connect people to work, to services, and to one another across long distances. Acknowledging that reality is not a contradiction. It's part of the argument. Cars serve a purpose in American life. The question is whether they should be the only way to participate in daily life, even in places where alternatives could realistically exist. Most Americans already have a relationship with cars. You may enjoy driving, you may depend on it, you may resent it. Often it's all three at once. Many people genuinely like driving. They enjoy the solitude, the control, the feeling of motion. Nothing here dismisses that experience. But enjoyment changes meaning when it becomes compulsory. A system built entirely around driving does not preserve freedom. It narrows it. Ask yourself, is driving something you choose or something you plan your life around because there's no alternative? Does your car feel like a hobby, a tool, or a requirement? And what would change if even one trip a day didn't require it? Those answers matter because this conversation is not abstract. It plays out every morning, on every commute, in every household. By the mid-20th century, the American transportation system had settled into a reinforcing pattern. As driving increased, pressure grew to expand roads. Expanded roads made development viable over greater distances. Greater distance made alternatives less practical, and fewer practical alternatives led to more driving. Today, planners describe this pattern as induced demand. When road capacity increases, traffic does not disappear, it reorganizes. New trips emerge, commutes lengthen, land spreads outward. Congestion returns, often close to previous levels. Los Angeles widened the I-405 freeway at a cost of over $1 billion. Within years, travel times stabilized near where they began. Atlanta expanded I-85, Houston expanded I-10, Phoenix expanded Loop 202. Each followed the same trajectory: more lanes, more travel, more distance. This system did not appear by accident. It was designed, and what was designed can be redesigned. Chapter 8: When cars became both culture and constraint. Infrastructure alone does not explain why this system endured. Because alongside growing dependence on driving, Americans developed a deep and genuine relationship with cars themselves. Automobiles became more than transportation. They became objects of skill, craft, and identity. That culture took different forms across the country. Here in Southern California, lowrider communities turned cars into moving expressions of art and heritage. Paint, hydraulics, and sound systems reflected neighborhood pride, family tradition, and visibility in public space. In the Midwest, hot rod culture grew out of post-war garages and industrial towns. Mechanics and machinists applied hands-on knowledge to engines and frames, transforming work skills into speed and competition. Detroit became both a production center and a cultural symbol, a place where cars were built, tested, and imagined. In the South, racing culture took hold. NASCAR evolved from informal regional races into one of the largest spectator sports in America. Cars became linked to regional identity, community ritual, and working-class pride. In the Southwest and Mountain West, automobiles represented access across long distances. Pickup trucks signaled utility, labor, and independence, often in places where alternatives were never feasible. Across urban America, car clubs formed around brands, eras, and styles. Weekend cruises, restoration garages, local car shows. From Bronx muscle cars to Bay Area imports to Texas truck meets, vehicles became sites of social life. Museums followed. Cars were preserved not just as machines, but as cultural artifacts. This attachment was reinforced by labor history. For much of the 20th century, the automobile industry provided stable, often unionized employment for millions of Americans. Assembly lines offered wages that supported homeownership, education, and upward mobility. The United Auto Workers became one of the most influential labor organizations in America. For many families, cars were not symbols alone. They were livelihoods. Entire regional economies, from Michigan to Ohio to Indiana, were shaped by auto manufacturing and its supply chains. This history matters because American appreciation for cars is real, it's not imagined, and it's not simply marketing. Cars offer autonomy, they provide privacy in a society with limited public space, they enable movement across vast distances, they carry tools, groceries, children, and memories. For many people, cars remain sources of enjoyment, not just obligation. But this distinction is essential. Appreciating cars is not the same as designing daily life so that driving is unavoidable. When driving becomes a default requirement, choice shrinks, flexibility declines, trips that could be optional become necessary, household expenses grow, and those who cannot drive because of age, disability, income, or health face real barriers to participation. This system also limits people who enjoy driving. Long commutes replace purposeful trips. Congestion erodes pleasure. Choice gives way to routine. The question is not whether cars belong in American life. They already do. The question is whether they should be the only way to meet daily needs, even in places where alternatives could realistically exist. Chapter 9. When transit doesn't scale and why choice still matters. Public transit is not universal. In rural areas and low-density regions, cars remain essential. The problem is not car access, it's car mandate. Even modest alternatives like safe sidewalks, protected bike lanes, compact land use, on-demand transit reduce risk and expand choice. When driving is optional, dangerous trips decline. Transportation becomes public health. Over 40,000 Americans die each year in traffic crashes, disproportionately young, low income, and working long hours. This harm is not inevitable. It's designed. America's car dependence was not an accident. It was built through subsidies, through zoning, through highways, through parking mandates. That system fit a specific moment. That moment has passed. Today, the average American household spends over $10,000 a year on transportation, mostly on cars, often the second largest expense after housing. At the same time, housing costs are rising. The population is aging. Traffic deaths have increased since 2020. Younger generations are delaying driver's licenses, but the infrastructure remains. The hopeful truth is this: anything created by policy can be changed by policy. Not everywhere, not all at once, but incrementally. Examples already exist. Austin is reconnecting the east and west side of the city with a cap and stitch program to rectify past harm done by freeways. Car-free neighborhoods like Cul-de-sac in Tempe, to pedestrianized streets in New York, to freeway removals in San Francisco. These places prove a simple point. Cars can remain part of American life without controlling it. Real freedom is not owning a vehicle. It's having a choice. The future isn't more lanes, it's more life. If you want to keep unpacking how planning, policy, and power shape everyday life, my name is Jasmine. This is Understanding Urbanism. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.